Que l'on ouvre les portes. Let the doors be open. Statements by members. Déclaration de député. The honourable member for Don Valley West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to recognize a remarkable Canadian, Valerie Dunn. Valerie celebrated her 90th birthday on January 18th. That in itself is remarkable, but I want to focus on Valerie's most significant contributions. In 1980, she started editing and publishing High Rise community newspaper. The paper has always been by and for people living in apartment and condo buildings in the Greater Toronto Area, focusing on community news. After 42 years, Valerie is still the editor and publisher of High Rise. It's published 11 times a year, going to many areas in Toronto, including my riding, and just as it was 42 years ago, it is free of charge. It's people like Valerie Dunn, energetic, innovative seniors, helping and informing neighbors, building community that motivate me to do the work that I do. Congratulations to Valerie, who at 90, in her words, will keep on trucking. Thank you, Mr.
Speaker. The honourable member for Coast of Bay Central Notre Dame.
Mr. Speaker, this past week, Newfoundland and Labrador lost one of its most accomplished citizens. Mr. Harry Steele passed away on January 28th. Born in Musgrave Harbour in 1929, he graduated from MUN and went on to join the Royal Canadian Navy, where he rose to the rank of Lieutenant Commander. Serving in the Navy prepared him for life in the business world, where he became an entrepreneurial icon. Mr. Steele began his business life with the purchase of the Albatross Motel in Gander. He quickly grew his hospitality business and expanded into aviation, transportation, printing and publishing, broadcasting, and the auto industry, to name a few. Mr. Steele received many tributes, and most notably, he was awarded the Order of Canada. After reminiscing with our mutual friend, Terry Hart, it was noted that Mr. Steele, like many from my province, enjoyed a good feed of salt fish. And like many as well, having a good chat. Mr. Speaker, please join me in sending our heartfelt condolences to Mr. Steele's wife, Catherine, and her sons, John, Peter, and Rob, and their families.
The honourable member for Mississauga Streetsville.
Mr. Speaker, on the morning of Saturday, January 15th, there was a dangerous house fire which took place in my riding. A 15-year-old and infant were able to escape. However, 3 other children were still trapped on the second floor of the home. Adam Atala, a resident of Mississauga Streetsville, bravely jumped into action when he saw the semi-detached home on fire. A neighbor led Adam into their home, allowing him to jump from the neighbor's roof onto the roof of the burning house. Adam was able to assist 2 of the children who were already on the roof down to safety. As a 3rd child was still trapped in the home, Adam broke the screen of the window to help the child evacuate the smoke-filled room. Adam's heroism and courageous actions ensured that all members of the family were able to flee the home harm-free. Adam's actions reflect the true Canadian spirit of how we as a country can come together to help our fellow Canadians in their time of need. Mr. Speaker, I ask my colleagues of both sides of the House to join me in thanking Adam for his heroic actions. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
L'honorable député de Manicouagan.
The honourable member for Manicouagan.
Au nom du Bloc québécois.
Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Bloc québécois, I'd like to highlight the re-election of Ghislain Picard for an 11th term as Chief of the Assembly of First Nations of Quebec and Labrador. Originally from Pessamit, Ghislain Picard is an Innu who embodies dedication, tenacity, and hope, and who works for ever-increasing consideration of the interests, development, and self-determination of First Nations. Uchima Picard is the Bloc québécois Indigenous Affairs critic. It will be a pleasure and an honor for me to continue building bridges with the First Nations you represent through a respectful, attentive, and continuous nation-to-nation dialogue.
Nanitamnika minu awachawat inuat ke anumat akwanika tutanchechi pimutayan chi tai munuwao. Au nom du Bloc québécois.
On behalf of the Bloc québécois, thank you. Chinashkumitin Uchima Picard for the colossal work that has already been done, and good luck for the work that remains to be done that we have yet to do. I wish you a good mandate.
Député d'Hochelaga.
The honourable member for Hochelaga.
Monsieur le Président, la semaine dernière, les nouvelles mesures
Mr. Speaker, last week, public health measures allowed the reopening of theaters and the movies. It was an announcement that we had been eagerly looking forward to, because let's face it, the cultural sector is probably the one that was most affected during the pandemic. Culture is part of our society. It reflects who we are and is also part of maintaining mental health. Let's never forget it. Hochelaga is full of innovative creators from all walks of life who manage to maintain their services to the population, such as the Théâtre Denis Pelletier, the Photocours, the Maison de la Culture Maisonneuve, and others. Yesterday, our government announced the launch of a $60 million Performing Arts Worker Resiliency Fund to support people working in the sector. This assistance is intended to help and comfort those who, every single day, give hope and courage to others during these difficult times. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Le député de Charlebourg.
The Honourable Member for Charlebourg-Haute-Saint-Charles.
Monsieur le Président, nos athlètes canadiens sont...
Mr. Speaker, our Canadian athletes will soon be in Beijing for the Olympic Games. And on behalf of the entire Conservative Party team, I wish them every success and many medals. But, according to Human Rights Watch, freedom of expression, which the International Olympic Committee is supposed to provide to athletes during the Beijing Games, means nothing in China. We know full well that human rights and freedom of expression just do not exist in China. Noting concerns about data privacy and spying, some Olympic teams in Europe advised athletes not to bring personal phones or laptops to Beijing. Tennis player Peng Shuai could confirm this, but she made the mistake of writing on social media that she had been sexually assaulted by a former senior member of the ruling Communist Party, and suddenly she disappeared. So yes, we're happy for our athletes, but we have no doubt that the Chinese Communist Party is unworthy of hosting the Olympic Games.
The Honourable Member for the Northwest Territories.
Mr. Speaker, in communities across the Northwest Territories, access to affordable housing is one of the biggest issues my constituents face. That's why I was so pleased last month to join the Minister of Housing and Diversity and Inclusion and local leaders for 3 announcements that will help more NBTers have a safe place to call home. With a $9 million federal investment, the Borealis Housing Cooperative will be able to improve the quality and energy efficiency of 50 units in Yellowknife. We also announced a $5 million top-up for our government's contributions to the Avens Pavilion project. This brings the total federal contribution to this 102-unit seniors facility to $38.7 million. And finally, the communities of Fort Good Hope, Lutzuke, and Fort Providence will have 29 new units thanks to a $9.8 million in funding from the Government of Canada. Our government is making real progress on making housing a reality for more Northerners, and I look forward to adding to this list of investments through the rest of 2022 and for the years to come. Merci Cho, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Member for Oakville North Burlington. Oui, nous avons.
En fait, nous signalait que le son était insuffisant pour faire la traduction, donc on n'a pas eu de traduction, monsieur.
Je m'excuse, j'ai rien entendu.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear anything.
Le problème est plus que je m'excuse pour. Est-ce que la députée de Manicouagan.
Can the member for Manicouagan repeat what she said?
Merci. Je vais enlever mon masque.
Thanks. I'll take my mask off, Mr. Speaker. Translation services said that the sound was insufficient for correct translation.
I want to remind all members that if they're talking online and if they're in the virtual setting, please use your headset, because without it, our translators or our interpreters cannot hear what you're saying, and people will not get the full impact of what you're trying to put across. And I know you all have very important messages that you want to get not only to other MPs, but to all Canadians. The Honourable Member for Oakville North Burlington.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Black History Month celebrates the many past and present accomplishments and contributions of Black Canadians that make our nation culturally diverse, resilient, and inclusive. This year's theme is February and Forever, celebrating Black history today and every day. I'd like to pay tribute to Veronica Tyrell, community leader, founder of the Canadian Caribbean Association of Halton, recipient of the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal, and tireless advocate for diversity and inclusion, and my friend. She was a trailblazer in our community, working with disadvantaged youth, police services, and highlighting Oakville's Black history, focusing on the town's role in the Underground Railroad and more. She was a champion of Black history and believed in equal opportunity for all. Veronica's hard work and legacy lives on, but I know she would also say there is more work to do to empower all Canadians, especially Black communities, and it is incumbent on each of us to finish her work. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Calgary-Shepherd.
The late Colin Powell once told the U.S. president, "You break it, you are going to own it." Well, the Prime Minister broke the real estate market, and now he owns this entire crisis. 2021 was a boom year. 667,000 residential properties changed hands that year, a 30% increase over a 10-year average. Average prices went from $434,000 to $811,000, an 81% inflation increase. And the Prime Minister's solution is a scheme from the CMHC called the First Time Home Buyers Incentive that was supposed to help 100,000 Canadians, but government documents show that it's only helped 14,000. They expanded the criteria 3 times. CMHC said they would reach 65,000 in a memo from November of 2020. It's a booming real estate year, record sales, record inflation. Only Canadian families have suffered. Fixing this mess starts with admitting mistakes. The FDHBI is a failure. It's time to abolish it.
The honourable member for Vaughan Woodbridge.
Mr. Speaker, we all know that great cities are built by exceptional citizens that contribute their time and efforts to building an inclusive community. Today, I wish to recognize community leaders in the City of Vaughan who were recently appointed to the Order of Vaughan, which pays tribute to those who have made a meaningful impact on Vaughan's civic life by dedicating their time and talents to the city's ongoing success. Mr. Speaker, I want to send my heartfelt congratulations to Joseph Scrow for his unwavering commitment to bringing healthcare services to our community, Elvira Caria, an outstanding leader dedicated to public service, and Yolanda De Simone Masci, a lifelong philanthropist, as well as the other recipients for their remarkable life work. Mr. Speaker, they embody the spirit of generosity that characterizes the residents of the City of Vaughan and make our city a better place to live in. Their achievements and contributions will impact many generations, and their stories will be forever etched in Vaughan's social fabric. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Caribou, Prince George.
Mr. Speaker, last August I was honoured to attend the start of the ground sonar search at the former residential school of St. Joseph's Mission in my hometown of Williams Lake. And last week, I, along with Canadians across the country, were heartbroken to hear the news out of my hometown that after completing phase 1 of the ground sonar search and searching only 4 of 400 hectares, the Bureau sites of 93 human remains were discovered. Mr. Speaker, this impacts my family and the families of friends, as we had loved ones that attended St. Joseph's Mission. Some came home and some did not. My heart breaks for the families and the communities who continue to be affected by the intergenerational trauma associated with the residential school system. Their pain is real and they deserve justice. To the communities and families, I stand with you and I continue to walk you down the path to reconciliation. I want to thank my good friend, Williams Lake First Nation, Kupi Willie Sellers, and his council and elders for their strong leadership through this extremely difficult time. As Chief Willie said last week, there can be no reconciliation without truth. Mr. Speaker, I agree. Thank you.
Here, here.
The honourable member for Perth, Wellington.
Mr. Speaker, Simon Edgar Dickert loved dinosaurs and sharks, the Kratt brothers and wild krats, and he was always smiling. Even while battling brain cancer for 4 years, he smiled through everything. He fought hard, and he stayed true to his beautiful personality and his sense of humor. When it came time for him to make a wish through the Make-A-Wish Foundation, he thought of everyone else first. He thought of his younger siblings, Sadie, Sean, and Emily, and his parents, Samantha and Tyler. And while he was thinking of everyone else, the community of Mount Forest was thinking of him. Through Gold Bikes for Simon, he became their superhero, raising funds and awareness for childhood cancer. Mount Forest lost its superhero on Christmas Eve Simon was only 7 years old. Mr. Speaker, may we all work for the day when kids can be kids and childhood cancer is no more. Thank you.
The honourable member for Sault Ste. Marie.
Mr. Speaker, when people think of Sault Ste. Marie's most notable individuals, one person always comes to mind. Dr. Roberta Bondar was born and raised in the Sioux, later going on to study at numerous universities and attained a PhD and a medical degree. On January 22nd, 1992, Dr. Bondar made history as Canada's first woman and the world's first neurologist to enter space. This year marks the 30th year since her amazing mission. She's a recipient of numerous accolades, including a companionship in the Order of Canada. In addition to her extensive scientific career, she's an avid photographer renowned for her natural exhibits on nature. Dr. Bondar continues to be heavily involved in community work and champions promoting literacy, science, and arts through her foundation. Dr. Bondar, congratulations on 30+ years of excellence, and thank you for all you do to Canada. You continue to inspire boys and girls of all ages to reach the stars. Please join me in congratulating Dr. Bondar.
The honourable member for Winnipeg Centre.
Mr. Speaker, I was shocked to find out that in Nova Scotia, sexual health centres are being forced to close between April and September due to lack of funding, leaving individuals without access to services. Further, 9 provinces have declared outbreaks of sexually transmitted infections. Access to sexual health centres and services are foundational for reproductive justice. Mr. Speaker, this government is a self-proclaimed feminist government. However, their behaviour reflects otherwise. I would like to remind this government that reproductive justice is critical for gender equality, and this includes the right of individuals to freely make choices about their reproductive health and access to reproductive services. I am imploring this government to recognize this right to bodily autonomy and support provinces in funding sexual health services to ensure this right is upheld. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
L'honorable député de Trois-Rivières.
The honourable member for Trois-Rivières. Mr. Speaker, I wish to pay tribute to an institution in my riding which is celebrating its 140th anniversary, its own Chamber of Commerce. It was founded in 1871, which makes it the oldest one in Quebec. It helped contribute to the building of several key facilities. For the first time, women were admitted. They led a campaign to convince the government to build a bridge over the St. Lawrence. In the 80s, it contributed to many key accomplishments, including revitalizing the downtown. Today, it includes many members who constitute a very strong business network, contributing to the success of its members. For the 140th anniversary of this organization, I want to congratulate the president, as well as the temporary PDG, and the entire board of directors.
Member for Peace River Westlock.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday in this House took these steps to adopt multiple motions deploring and condemning hateful and racist symbols. These motions were adopted unanimously. It was the right thing to do. We must also denounce hateful and racist actions whenever they happen, including anti-Muslim, anti-Black, or them if they're directed at any group. Every person possesses inherent God-given dignity, and as legislatures, it's incumbent on us to protect this dignity and condemn racism in all its forms. Blackface has a painful history. From minstrel shows in the 19th century to more recent examples, blackface continues to portray racist caricatures of Black people. Yesterday, the Liberals blocked the unanimous consent motion that I brought in this chamber condemning the use of blackface. Mr. Speaker, I urge all parties in this House to be united in fighting all forms of racism and anti-Black hate, including the use of blackface. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Hull Aylmer.
Every February, I normally rise to encourage parliamentarians and Canadians to celebrate Black History Month. These are not normal times. This past weekend, a small minority thought it acceptable to bring swastikas and Confederate flags to Parliament Hill. Let's not mince words. The Confederate flag is a symbol for slavery. Whips deformed black bodies, forced labor mangled limbs, torture almost always preceded lynchings. Intellectually, I know that very, very few people today would support what the Confederate flag represented. I will assume that the Confederate flag was tolerated this weekend out of respect for the individual's freedom of expression. However, in my heart, I was left wondering, who else supports this flag? Without real-time denunciations, how am I to know? That's what scares me. Even after 188 years since the abolition of slavery in Canada, in some people's eyes, I am not equal, nor should I be free. This is why I celebrate Black history, Black Canadian history, every February and throughout the year. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral questions. Question orale. The honourable member for Portage-Lisgar.
Outside is now in its 5th day. I know the Prime Minister doesn't agree with the truckers and their supporters, but he does have some responsibility as a Prime Minister to help bring some resolution. Can the Prime Minister tell this House and tell all Canadians if he has any plans to help these folks feel like they've been heard? Does he have any plans to bring some resolution to the situation that's going on right now outside?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to begin by recognizing the member for Durham and thanking him for his service. There is a lot we don't agree on for the direction of this country, but he stepped up to serve his country, and I want to thank him for his sacrifice, and also particularly Rebecca, Molly, and Jack for being part of what is a very, very difficult life for even the most successful of us. In regards to the vaccine mandates, we had an election on those 6 months ago, and Canadians overwhelmingly supported politicians who were firm that vaccinations are the way through this pandemic.
The honourable member for Portage-Lisgar.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I do thank the Prime Minister. We're not fully able to hear his answer, but I heard the beginning of it in the end, and I do thank him for the remarks he made about the member from Durham, and we really appreciate that. I do want to go back to the issue at hand, and I totally get, and I think we've all heard the Prime Minister doesn't agree with the position of these protesters. I think that that's clear, but he has a responsibility as Prime Minister to help bring some resolution. And if they feel that they've at least been heard, they could maybe start to make some plans to go back home to their families. So what is his plan to bring some resolution to this impasse?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, from the beginning of this pandemic, we've been focused on encouraging Canadians to do the right things, to be there for their neighbours, for the frontline health workers, vulnerable people in their families. That means following public health advice. That means getting vaccinated. That means being there for each other as communities in respect and in support. And we have been extraordinarily engaged in encouraging people to continue to get vaccinated. And over 100,000 Canadians got their first doses just last week. There is more to do, and we will continue to listen to people who have concern as we work together.
The honourable member for Portage-Lisgar.
Mr. Speaker, we all know the supply chain is fragile, and it's causing great challenges to families across the country who are facing price increases. We know the pandemic has created tremendous stress on all parts of the economy, but the Prime Minister has definitely added another layer to this already problematic situation. Will the Prime Minister admit that he is responsible for adding another layer of burden on families, and what is he going to do to fix this?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
The Conservatives seem to be under the mistaken understanding that our supply chains have been disrupted by vaccine mandates, when in fact our supply chains have been disrupted by COVID. And the best way to counter COVID is to make sure that people can do their jobs and continue to deliver goods to Canadians so we can get through this in safety. And that means following the lead of the almost 90% of Canadians truckers who have been vaccinated and getting vaccinated. That's how we get through this.
Honorable député. The honourable member for Louis Saint Laurent. Well, the least we can say is that COVID is having an impact, but the Prime Minister isn't acting. In his last report, the PBO said that if the government continues on this path of spending in an out-of-control fashion, it will have a direct impact on inflation. And he shouldn't blame this on COVID, because the PBO himself said that COVID was not causing inflation. It was government spending. So the Prime Minister doesn't listen to families, doesn't listen to the opposition, but he can at least listen to the PBO and start controlling spending. The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I'm certain that the Parliamentary Budget Officer did not say that COVID had no impact on inflation. We know very well that the global inflation crisis we're going through is directly linked to COVID-19. And the best way to get our economy back on track, to help people get through this pandemic and through this health crisis, is to be there for each other. And that's the promise that we made at the very beginning, and that's what we'll continue to do. The Honourable Member for Louis Saint Laurent. Well, one reality that all Canadian families are facing, Mr. Speaker, including wealthier ones and poorer ones, is inflation. That has a real direct impact on families when they go to the grocery store, for example. Currently, the annual grocery bill for a family is $1,000 more due to inflation. You'd have to go back 30 years to see that kind of inflation rate. According to the Prime Minister, the whole world is facing the exact same problem. No, Mr. Speaker, Canada is facing this problem because it has out-of-control spending. When will the Prime Minister rein it in? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. It's disappointing to see the Conservative Party of Canada completely ignore facts and reality. They're not recognizing that inflation is a worldwide phenomenon that is directly linked to COVID. It's not something that we created here in Canada, but it's something that we are reacting to. And as a government, we've reacted to it as we always have from the very beginning. We've reacted to it by standing there for Canadians and giving everything it takes. The Conservatives want us to do less, but we will be there to help Canadian families as we've always promised. The Honourable Member for Belleuil-Chambly. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Allow me to also show respect for the member for Durham, who had always shown great rigor and commitment to this country. Well, it doesn't often happen, but on a few points, the Prime Minister and I agree. Protesting is a right, but it needs to be regulated. It's probably not a good idea to protest too much during a pandemic. The pandemic has gone on for a long time, and the protests are concerning. Now, can the Prime Minister tell us what he intends to do, concretely speaking, to end the protest crisis outside? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, my colleague for Belleuil-Chambly knows that it is not up to politicians to direct police forces. The police do their work independently, but as a government, we will ensure that we provide all of the resources necessary for law enforcement agencies to do the work that they need to do to keep Canadians safe. and, of course, to ensure that the residents of Ottawa can get back to their normal lives very quickly, we hope. The Honourable Member for Belleuil-Chambly. I mentioned to the Prime Minister a number of things that could be done and that the federal government could do under its jurisdiction. For example, they could encourage the protesters on the Hill to leave. But all of the proposals we made were not picked up by the Prime Minister. He has done nothing. Now, has the Prime Minister laid down a timeline for the protesters leaving? And how long will he tolerate this situation before taking action? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, my honourable colleague knows well that a few days ago I did say that it was time for these protesters to leave, that they have been heard and that they should now leave Ottawa so that residents here and parliamentarians can go on with their lives and their work. We will continue to work with law enforcement agencies to ensure that people are protected and to ensure that this protest, which is now becoming illegal, does come to an end. The Honourable Member for Burnaby South.
Since the beginning of this pandemic, healthcare workers have been harassed. They've been the subject of a verbal assault. They've been blocked from going to their places of work. Vaccination centers have been shut down. We passed a law to protect healthcare workers, but it's not being enforced. At a minimum, we need to make sure frontline healthcare workers are safe in doing the important work of protecting us and saving our lives. Why are the laws to protect healthcare workers not being enforced?
Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Leader of the NDP and indeed all parliamentarians who supported our law to bring extra protections to frontline healthcare workers. There is no excuse and no reason for a frontline health worker to be verbally assaulted or harassed on their way into work to save the lives of Canadians. That's why we move forward on that, and that's why we will always stand to ensure that our frontline health workers are getting the protections they need while they are busy protecting the rest of us.
The Honourable Member for Burnaby South.
I also want to take a moment to acknowledge the work and the sacrifice of the member from Durham. We disagreed fundamentally on how to help Canadians, but I want to thank him for his service. Depuis le début de cette...
Since the beginning of this pandemic, our healthcare workers have been harassed, verbally assaulted, and even prevented from going to their workplaces. At a minimum, we need to make sure that these healthcare workers who have done so much to help and protect us can do their work. We passed a law to protect them, but currently that law is not being adequately enforced. Why are these laws to protect healthcare workers not being enforced? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We entirely agree, and I'd like to thank all of the members in this House, including the NDP leader, for having supported our bill to create new protective measures for healthcare workers. They do not need to be harassed, insulted, and frightened when they're just trying to do their work to protect other Canadians. That's why we will continue to ensure that we are doing everything necessary to protect them as they do their work.
For Thornhill.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians are undoubtedly frustrated with the continued COVID restrictions. This weekend, the Transport Minister stated that the cross-border trucking mandate is temporary, but that new interprovincial vaccine mandates for truckers are on the way. The Canadian Chamber of Commerce, the CFIB, manufacturers and exporters have all called the existing vaccine mandate harmful, bad policy on our fragile supply chain. The government continues to ignore the frustration. Is the mandate temporary, or is he expanding it?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
What the Conservative Party seems to continue to not understand is the threat to our supply chains is COVID, not vaccinations. That's why we will continue, as we told Canadians we would in the last election, to encourage strongly all Canadians to get vaccinated, including with mandates for anyone who travels by plane or train, including for members of the federal public service, and including for people in federally regulated industries. The way we get through this is through vaccines, and that's what we're going to stay steadfast to.
Well, member for Thornhill.
Prime Minister should talk to the Transport Minister because the Transport Minister knows that 14,000 less loads entered Canada in the first week of this cross-border mandate. And the Minister knows that the price of a load has increased 300% to 400% since the beginning of this mandate. And the Minister knows that the Canadian business community, as well as trucking organizations, have all expressed their concern about this cross-border mandate on our fragile supply chain. So I'll ask again, when will the Minister officially ignore all of these stakeholders and all of these facts and announce an additional provincial mandate?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, once again, the vulnerabilities to our supply chain come from COVID. The way to counter COVID is through vaccinations. I would encourage the members of the Conservative Party to listen to the almost 90% of truckers in this country who've chosen to get vaccinated, to keep themselves safe, to keep their families safe, to keep our frontline health workers from getting overwhelmed, and to continue to be able to do their jobs of putting food on Canadians' tables. We thank them deeply for their continued work, and we'll always be there to support and protect them.
Member for Barrie Innisfil.
In December, we found out that the Liberals were secretly tracking the mobility data of 33 million Canadians during the pandemic. The only reason Canadians found out is because a request for proposal was issued to continue tracking the mobility data for another 5 years. Serious concerns have been raised by security and surveillance experts on what security measures and protocols were put in place to protect the personal privacy data of 33 million Canadians who were spied on. On Monday, the Ethics Committee unanimously passed the motion to postpone the RFP. Will the Prime Minister respect the committee's decision and cancel the RFP?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Unlike the Conservative Party, we believe data and evidence need to inform our response to COVID-19. It's crucial to inform policy and decision-making. The Public Health Agency of Canada has used de-identified data without personal identifiers to inform the government's response to the pandemic and worked closely with the Privacy Commissioner throughout. We've also publicly provided Canadians with that information since 2020 to keep them informed. We remain focused on Canadians' health and safety and continue to uphold the privacy standards they rightfully expect.
Member for Barrie Innisfil.
I wish the Prime Minister felt that way about the Winnipeg lab documents. Security and privacy experts are concerned about the security protocols and measures that were put in place to protect the privacy of Canadians in this data scoop. Why was it done in secret without the user's consent? Why wasn't the Privacy Commissioner consulted? Where a Canadian eats, where they get gas, what family members they visit, and how many times they go to Costco is no business of this government, especially in a pandemic. Does the Prime Minister not understand that personal privacy protection is the foundation of our democracy?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Once again, Mr. Speaker, we see that the Conservatives continue their ill-informed and ill-advised war on data. As we said, we have worked with the Privacy Commissioner to ensure that all data is de-identified, but Canadians can understand that in a public health crisis like this pandemic, it is important to be able to do everything necessary to keep Canadians safe while respecting their privacy, which is exactly what we've done. While the Conservatives continue their war on data and vaccines, we'll continue to do everything we need to keep Canadians safe and uphold their rights and freedoms.
The Honourable Member for Bellechasse-les-Etchemins-Lévis. Mr. Speaker, two food banks in my ridings are starting to see people come in that they've never seen before. And the demand for food from food banks has doubled. Now we're not just seeing people who might be on unemployment insurance, but also people who are working, who have a salary, but still can't make ends meet. Does the Prime Minister recognize that Canadians are having such a hard time paying their grocery bills? They're even having a hard time paying for gas and housing. Gas was $1.61 yesterday in my riding. The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, we know that food insecurity is something that affects a huge number of Canadians and has been affecting them from the beginning of this pandemic. That's why we dedicated hundreds of millions of dollars to support community organizations that are there to help families in need. With the rising cost of food and the pandemic, we will be there for them. We will continue to help these community organizations and volunteers who are working tirelessly to help their fellow citizens. We will continue to be there for Canadians as we promised at the beginning of this pandemic. The Honourable Member for Bellechasse-les-Aides-Chemin-Lévis. But we're not seeing the results of those efforts on the ground. People can't buy food. They're having a hard time buying houses. They're having a hard time paying their rent. So can the Prime Minister stop answering from his brain and start answering from his heart and actually address these Canadians in need? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. I understand how tired and frustrated Canadians are. This pandemic has been going on for 2 years, and it has brought many, many struggles to Canadians, including when it comes to the cost of living. That's why we're investing in affordable housing, we're investing in more daycare spots, and we're helping Canadians through this extremely difficult situation. We will continue to be there for them. And $8 out of $10 of all of the aid provided to Canadians came from the federal government in this pandemic. We will continue to be there for people. The Honourable Member for Belleuil-Chambly. Mr. Speaker, money always comes out of taxpayers' pockets. I hope that the Prime Minister won't tell us, won't do what he did in the past and defer responsibility to the province's municipalities. Right now, people in this community are having to listen to horns day and night. People are being harassed and intimidated. We've heard that things are degenerating and that camps are even being set up by protesters. Is it not time that we set a deadline for the end of these unfortunate protests? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, one of the important issues with a situation like this is to respect our institutions, systems, and laws. The member for Belleuil-Chambly knows very well that politicians are not the ones who order law enforcement agencies to take any particular action. We are here to provide resources if law enforcement agencies request them, but they are the ones who are doing the work on the ground, and we want to see a peaceful resolution to this conflict. The Honourable Member for Belleuil-Chambly. The Prime Minister takes responsibility when he feels like it and doesn't take responsibility when he's too afraid to do so. Now, we've made clear proposals that have to do with federal jurisdiction. We talked about talking to the truckers who are favorable to vaccination. Does he intend to actually do anything? Or will he simply throw petty insults at them while they camp out for the long term? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, other parties may play partisan games, but we remain focused on Canadians and on people who need help. And yes, that includes the people of Ottawa who are having a hard time getting to work and living their lives in their home city. We will take action to end these protests, and we are going to continue to invest to help families, to help small businesses, and to help the country get through this pandemic.
Member for Calgary Nose Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could the Prime Minister please update the House and tell us what percentage of Canadians currently rely on foreign imported energy to heat their homes?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we know how important it is to continue to invest in transforming our energy mix in this country. With climate change a reality that almost all Canadians understand and accept, we need to make sure we're drawing on the expertise of our energy sector, of our energy workers, to be able to transform towards lower carbon sources of electricity and energy. That's exactly what we are focused on right now. I'm pleased that the Conservative Party seems to understand that we need to transform our energy mix. I look forward to working with them and with all Canadians across this country to make that happen.
Honourable member for Calgary Nose Hill.
I actually didn't expect him to know the answer. I mean, why would he, right? It's 30%. 30% of Canadians rely on foreign imported energy to heat their homes. Energy prices are out of control. And when he talks about transforming our energy mix, Mr. Speaker, he should be talking about transforming it to sovereign produced Canadian energy that is rapidly decarbonized instead of offshoring our jobs. Will he commit to ending Canada's reliance on high carbon imported foreign energy?
Honourable Prime Minister.
I have committed Canada to ending its reliance on carbon-intensive fuels. We are going to reach net zero by 2050. And that is going to be something that we will only accomplish by working with and leaning on the extraordinary energy workers across this country who've created such extraordinary energy industry across this country and who are going to be a central part of moving us beyond our reliance on fossil fuels to be able to support ourselves with cleaner energy. That's the goal that we have on this side of the House, Mr. Speaker. It would be nice to see.
Member for Calgary Nose Hill.
That's really interesting, Mr. Speaker, because you know what he's asked the Natural Resources Minister to do in his mandate letter? End energy sector jobs. That's actually in the Natural Resource Minister's mandate. So instead of diversifying our energy mix, he should be trying to ensure that Canadian energy workers have jobs, not offshore to Saudi Arabia. Will he say today that he will commit to ending the tankers of Saudi high-carbon, high-fossil fuel oils and instead commit to protecting energy sector worker jobs in Canada?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the Conservative Party of Canada is doing no benefit to workers in the oil industry when it pretends that all will be well as they whistle past the graveyard, because the reality is the world is moving off of fossil fuels. It'll take decades, but it is doing that. And what we need to do is plan for and create those good jobs in the energy industry that will come from renewables, come from hydrogen, come through technologies like CCUS. Unfortunately, the Conservative Party of Canada is doubling down on an approach.
Member for Calgary Nose Hill.
Canadians know what just inflation looks like. Higher prices, less stuff on the shelves. Let me tell you what just transition looks like. Higher greenhouse gas emissions and more offshore jobs. This Prime Minister has seen greenhouse gas emissions rise under his time in office. He's seen us spend billions and billions and billions of dollars on debt, all while erasing good-paying Alberta and Saskatchewan jobs in the energy sector. Instead of giving our jobs to Saudi Arabia, he should be working with the energy sector to reduce its reliance. Why hasn't he done so?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
At least Canadians are faced with a very clear choice right now. I thank the member for Nose Hill for being so articulate about it. Canadians can either move forward on continuing to rely on fossil fuels, or they can choose the path that this government has taken to ensure that we're supporting our energy workers as we transform towards less reliance on fossil fuels, as we get to net zero. I know the future that Canadians want to choose because that's how they voted in the last election, for parties serious about fighting climate change. I really hope the Conservatives take a hard look at that policy.
Well, member for Burnaby South.
Mr. Speaker, it is inexcusable
that after every wave, our healthcare system continues to be on the brink of collapse. This isn't a surprise. COVID has exposed that our healthcare system is fragile because of decades of underfunding by federal governments, whether conservative or liberal. We need to make sure our healthcare system is there for people when they need it most. The Prime Minister wants to wait until after the pandemic. We disagree. People can't afford to wait. People need that care now. So will the Prime Minister commit to increasing healthcare transfers immediately to protect our healthcare system and the people who need it most?
Honorable Prime Minister.
Every year, the federal government transfers over $40 billion to the provinces for the delivery of healthcare in their jurisdictions. On top of that, over the past 2 years, we invested an additional $63 billion in healthcare investments and things that include vaccines, but also include transfers to provinces. We know that there is a need for us to step up in healthcare, and we have done so both immediately, and we've committed to doing so in the future. And we look forward to robust conversations with the provinces on how best to deliver good health care for all Canadians.
The honourable member for Burnaby South.
La réalité, c'est notre...
The reality is that our health system is in danger. We need sustainable funding. This means an increase in healthcare transfers. Every time we have a new wave of COVID-19, we can't accept that our healthcare system becomes fragile. We need support right now. The Prime Minister says we have to wait until after the pandemic is over, but people can no longer wait. Can the Prime Minister commit to increasing health transfers immediately? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, the reality is that in addition to the $43 billion that we're sending the provinces every year for their healthcare systems, over the past 2 years, we spent $63 billion more on things like vaccines, tests, transfers to provinces, support for healthcare systems to ensure that we can be here for people across the country. And yes, I've already committed to transferring more money to the provinces, and we will do so, but we need conversations to make sure things are done properly and that we deliver true results for Canadians.
The honourable member for Etobicoke Centre.
Thank you, Speaker. In 2014, Russia twice invaded Ukraine, first in Crimea and then in eastern Ukraine. Recently, Russia has massed over 130,000 soldiers on Ukraine's border and is threatening a further invasion of Ukraine. This further Russian aggression is a threat to not only Ukraine's security, but to Europe's security, to that of our allies, and to Canada's security. Could the Prime Minister please explain what steps Canada has taken and will take to deter a Russian invasion of Ukraine and to protect Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity?
Excellent question.
Right, Honourable Prime Minister.
I want to thank the member for Etobicoke Centre for his tireless advocacy on behalf of the Ukrainian community, both here in Canada and abroad. We're working with our NATO allies, and we've extended Operation Unifier. We continue to work with them to coordinate our responses to deter further Russian aggression. When Ukraine needed support financially, we were there with a loan of $120 million. When Ukraine needed more support for military training, we stepped up. And when Ukraine needed more cyber support, we were there. Rest assured, we will continue with our support for Ukraine.
The honourable member for Foothills.
Mr. Speaker, farmers and ranchers across Western Canada are out on the roads protesting and desperately trying to be heard. The feed crisis across Western Canada is devastating. And a chinwag with CP Rail and a virtual supply summit has done nothing to address a critical animal health issue. And the trucking mandates are making things even worse for Manitoba pork producers. With this crisis, why is the Prime Minister ignoring Western Canadian farmers? Why isn't he doing something to address this feed shortage crisis?
Right, Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, COVID has disrupted our lives in many many different ways, and things are hard for farmers like they are hard for people right across the country, even as we rely on them to continue to put food on our tables, to continue to support us. So we thank them for that. We will continue to make sure we are getting through this pandemic the best way possible. That means making sure people get vaccinated to stay safe and not overwhelm our health systems, and be there with supports for small businesses, for farmers, for industries that are hard hit by this pandemic. Those supports are what is helping us through and making our recovery so strong.
Honourable member for Foothills.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister's Liberal policies are making it more difficult for Canadians to even purchase groceries and afford the food that they need. But when they are contributing to an animal health crisis, that is a new low for this government. Instead of gauging the feed in their bins by the weeks or even the months, the ranchers are gauging it by the minute. Many of them are scraping the bottom of the bin. Producers and cattle ranchers are putting their animals on rations. Pork producers in Manitoba, Quebec, and Ontario are culling their herds. This is an animal health crisis. So when there is a crisis, why is the Prime Minister's default to blame Canadians instead of finding a solution?
Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we know what the solution is, and we've been working on the solution with Canadians for the past 2 years. Keep supporting small businesses, keep supporting our ranchers and farmers, continue to rely on science and evidence and public health measures to minimize the impacts of this pandemic, continue to invest, to be there for people. While the Conservative Party has criticized us for doing too much to support Canadians, we know that investing up front to support Canadians is what has led us to have a strong economic recovery and low impacts of COVID. There are still challenges. We will continue to be there.
Member for Foothills.
So, Mr. Speaker, the Agriculture Minister came back from Washington and said the U.S. mainland is going to be open to PEI potatoes in the coming weeks, and we'll have access to Puerto Rico maybe this week. So, shockingly, I guess it was a political dispute and had nothing to do with the quality of PEI potatoes. So, knowing now that it is a political dispute, will the Liberals lift their self-imposed export ban on potatoes to the United States this month, yes or no?
Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, when I sat down with President Biden just a few months ago, we spent time directly speaking about this potato issue. We know that the hard work and the quality of the potatoes grown in Prince Edward Island is without dispute. We support those farmers. We support farmers across the country. We will continue to work with our partners, particularly the United States in this case, to resolve it and to demonstrate that Canadian potatoes are among the best in the world.
Member for Foothills.
Mr. Speaker, Islanders aren't looking for promises, they're looking for results. The Agriculture Minister said that Secretary Vilsack said that they would have access to the U.S. mainland and Puerto Rico perhaps this week, yet still nothing has happened. And now Secretary Vilsack has said there is absolutely no timeline to reopen the United States mainland or Puerto Rico to PEI potatoes. That is not what the Agriculture Minister promised PEI potato growers. So, do we believe the Agriculture Minister, the Prime Minister, or Secretary Vilsack? Who's telling the truth?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as Islanders know well, we have been engaged on this issue from the very beginning. Ministers Bibeau and McCauley had a very effective trip to Washington just last week, where they were able to engage directly on finding solutions for this issue. We know how difficult it is for Islanders, but we are going to continue to stay on their side, by their sides, working with them to resolve this as quickly as possible.
The Honourable Member for Jonquière. Mr. Speaker, everyone is exhausted from COVID, but the ones who are the most aren't those who are the ones honking their horns outside. It's the caregivers who have been struggling for 2 years. And unfortunately, healthcare workers don't have the attention or support of the PM. The healthcare system is crumbling, and the Prime Minister must do his part to rebuild it. He needs to do his part to hire more people and to increase capacity and the quality of care. And doing his part also means increasing healthcare transfers. Does the Prime Minister understand this? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, since the beginning of the pandemic, not only have we transferred $43 billion per year to provinces for their healthcare systems, but we've also spent $63 billion additionally on healthcare expenses to help Canadians and healthcare systems to get through this pandemic. We have shown that we are here to help Canadians like we promised. 8 out of every $10 in all the assistance sent to Canadians during this pandemic came from the federal government and not the provinces. The honourable member for Jonquière, that's reassuring. The $63 billion that the Prime Minister is talking about is for emergency measures. We won't see that money in healthcare. But we knew the healthcare system was underfunded before the pandemic, and it will be also after. And now, and that is why Quebec and all the provinces are asking for healthcare transfers to be increased and for the healthcare system to be rebuilt. It will be the task for 2022. Will the Prime Minister contribute to this? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Yes, Mr. Speaker. I committed last year to be there to increase healthcare transfers. How to do so to deliver the best healthcare and results for Canadians? Well, that will be the subject of discussions we will have with provinces right now. But yes, we will be there like we were there during the pandemic to make sure that we have quality healthcare for all Canadians across the country. The honourable member for Mégantic-L'Érable. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For almost 2 years now, we've been fighting against this pandemic. Yesterday, I asked the Minister of Finance, how can parents pay their groceries with the rampant inflation that we're dealing with, not seen in 30 years? And the only answer I got, Mr. Speaker, was inflation is worse elsewhere than here in Canada. It doesn't put food on the table for Canadians. And I'll try again with the Prime Minister. Everything costs more today. How long will he tolerate the impoverishment of Canadians? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, since the beginning of this pandemic, we made a simple promise to Canadians that continues with the commitment we made in 2015, to be here for Canadians, to support them during tough times. And that is what we did throughout the pandemic, despite the Conservatives who said we were doing too much for families. And we're going to continue to be there for them. Initiatives for creating more daycare spots and for affordable daycare across the country is making an enormous difference in the lives of families, even though the Conservatives are against that initiative. The honourable member from Mégantic-L'Érable. Mr. Speaker, when you go in the grocery aisles and you see the cost of chicken, meat, the cost of everything, all the prices are going up by 5.7%. Well, you don't wonder where the money's coming from and who's doing what. You just wonder how you're going to pay your groceries when you get to the cash. Do you have to put something aside? Because what you'll see at the cash register will be higher than the amount you have in your pocket to pay. And that's what concerns family, Mr. Speaker, family. And when people have to go to food banks, well, there's 10 or 15% more people going to them. And we wonder how far this government will go by letting Canadians become increasingly poor. The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, since the very beginning of this pandemic, we understood that the best thing to do was to be here for Canadians. And that's exactly what we did. Not only to battle this healthcare crisis and save lives, but also to make sure that our economy would recover quickly throughout and after this pandemic. That's what we did, and that's what we're doing right now through a very strong economic recovery. We've seen more jobs return in Canada than other countries have, and we're going to continue to be here to help families, including throughout this crisis in terms of the cost of living and affordability. The honourable member from Mégantic-L'Érable. Mr. Speaker, the only winners in this inflation is the government. Because if everything costs more money, people have to pay more taxes, Mr. Speaker. That's the reality. Mr. Speaker, if our economy is going so well, like the Prime Minister says, how come mothers and fathers can't seem to make ends meet? How come they have decisions to make when they have to feed their families? The question we're asking right now is, when will the Prime Minister take action and realize that inflation of 5% or 6% or 7% or 8% or 9% or 10%, 11%? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Once again, we see that the Conservative Party is having a hard time understanding reality that Canadians are facing. We are in a pandemic that is global. It has had a great impact on the cost of living, on food supply chains, and yes, on inflation. And the best way to end this and to minimize the impact, the best way to do this is through vaccination. It is through public health measures. But the Conservative Party can't even convince its own members to get vaccinated. The Honourable Member for Pontiac. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Suicide is the 9th leading cause of death in Canada, and the 2nd leading cause of death in people aged 15 to 34 years of age. The suicide rate amongst Indigenous people is even higher. North of my riding, Mr. Speaker, Indigenous communities face many barriers and are very affected by this issue. This week is the 32nd National Suicide Prevention Week in Quebec, and this year's theme is Talking About Suicide Saves Lives. The Right Honourable Prime Minister. I'd like to thank the member for her question and for her commitment. Our thoughts go out to the loved ones of those we have lost to suicide and for those who suffer from suicidal thoughts. We'd like to support all Canadians and ask them to develop the app that is available 7 days a week, 24/7. We're also committed to fully funding and establishing a national suicide prevention hotline. No one should have to be ashamed to ask for help.
Selkirk Interlake Eastman.
Mr. Speaker, Russia is threatening to further invade Ukraine and has massed over 100,000 troops on its borders. While the world is watching, hoping Canada would do more and stand up and do the right thing, this Prime Minister sent his Foreign Affairs and Defense Minister to Kiev empty-handed. Half measures are not going to get this job done. We know that President Putin is provoked by weakness, the very weakness this Prime Minister is demonstrating. When will the Prime Minister actually stand with Ukraine and send them the lethal defensive weapons they've asked for?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I know the member for Selkirk Interlake has a strong Ukrainian community in his riding, and I'm glad he continues to stand with us for Ukraine. But I will highlight that if he had actually spoken with Ukrainian officials and leaders, he would know that their number one ask was for $120 million of sovereign loan for economic supports, which we delivered in days, and an extension of Operation Unifier to make sure that Ukrainians themselves have all the necessary training and abilities to defend their territory, as we know they will. Canada stands in solidarity with Ukraine and will continue to.
The Honourable Member for Selkirk Interlake Eastman.
Well, Mr. Speaker, empty rhetoric and good wishes aren't enough to stop the Russian invasion. The Prime Minister knows he's offside with their NATO allies. Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, the United States, United Kingdom have all provided lethal defensive weapons. Ukraine needs our support now before Russia invades, not after. When will the Prime Minister send defensive lethal weapons, restore the supply of RadarSat images, and apply Magnitsky sanctions against those responsible for this escalation?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Once again, we see the Conservatives trying to mislead Canadians on what we're actually doing. We are delivering the support that Ukraine asked for, both economic support and, most importantly, expanding immediately Operation Unifier, which is an extraordinarily successful operation that has trained over 33,000 Ukraine military forces to be able to stand strongly against any further Russian incursion. We are working closely with the government of Ukraine and all of our NATO allies to demonstrate that we are strong with Ukraine and united against any further Russian incursions.
The honourable member for Selkirk Interlake Eastman.
Well, the Prime Minister knows that an invasion is imminent, and he knows that sending soft aid isn't going to fix the situation. Buying pillows, this isn't going to work. This isn't a pillow fight. He knows that the non-essential diplomatic staff at our embassy in Kiev have been evacuated. He knows that our soldiers in Operation Unifier have all been moved west. Instead of standing by and watching Russia invade, will the Prime Minister finally do the right thing and give Ukraine the lethal weapons it desperately needs now? Not later, now.
The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Let me check with the...
Mr. Speaker, Canada, alongside its allies, stands with Ukrainian governments, Ukrainian people, Ukrainian territorial integrity. That is what we have always done. Every different country looks for the best ways it can help. And what Canada is continuing to do is something that is extraordinarily valuable to the Ukrainian people, which is Operation Unifier, which is direct training of tens of thousands of Ukraine military personnel to be able to defend their country. It has been the #1 ask of President Zelensky and others, along with financial supports that we delivered in days. We will continue to do what is needed to de-escalate the situation and to stand with
the honourable member for Brampton Centre.
Mr. Speaker, as we know, one of the ways we can prevent transmission of the COVID-19 and to protect our families and communities is the use of rapid tests. At the beginning of January, our government committed to obtaining 140 million rapid tests by the end of the month. Can the Prime Minister tell us how many rapid tests Canada has received since the beginning of the 2022? Thank you.
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
I want to thank the member for Brampton Centre for his question and for his hard work. We're working around the clock to keep Canadians safe and ensure provinces and territories have the tools they need to fight COVID-19, first and foremost with enough vaccines for everyone. But that also includes procuring more rapid tests. We committed to procuring 140 million new rapid tests in January of 2022, and that's exactly what we've done, with millions more arriving every day. We hope all parties will support the legislation we introduced this week, a $2.5 billion investment to continue purchasing all the necessary supports for Canadians.
Well, member for Burnaby South.
New Democrats have long been raising the concern that clawbacks to GIS are impacting vulnerable seniors who can't pay their bills or pay their rent. We know that the Prime Minister is talking about fixing this problem in May, but seniors can't afford to wait until May. We just learned of a senior who passed away yesterday. They had their GIs clawed back. They could not afford the nutritious meals they needed, nor could they afford the type 2 diabetes medication that they needed. I'm haunted by the thought that this senior might still be with us today if their GIS was not clawed back. So will the Prime Minister commit to fixing this problem now and not waiting until May?
Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, our priority has always been to be there for the most vulnerable, especially our seniors. That's why we worked hard to strengthen income security for seniors, including with increases to GIS. We're making major investments through a one-time payment for seniors whose benefit had been affected by pandemic supports. We know we have more work to do, and we're still going to be there to support seniors and look forward to working with all parliamentarians to do exactly that.
Member for Spadina, Fort York.
Mr. Speaker, my question is to Minister of Mental Health and Addictions. Colleagues representing urban centres, along with just about everywhere else, is fully aware of the opioid crisis in Canada. The number of deaths and related destruction in our communities is staggering. I've seen this firsthand on my safety walks with Toronto Police. In 2020, my riding Spadina, Fort York saw 57 deaths, the second highest fatality zone in Toronto. Mr. Speaker, opioids claim the lives of 19 Canadians per day, and over 24,000 have died. Can the Minister inform this House what the government is doing to end the carnage?
Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we all know that the opioid epidemic has worsened during this pandemic. We have to continue treating this as a health issue, not a criminal one. The first ever federal Minister of Mental Health and Addictions will be advancing a comprehensive strategy, supporting the provinces and territories and working with Indigenous communities to provide access to a full range of evidence-based treatment and harm reduction, to improving public education and reducing stigma, and to create standards for substance use treatment programs. We will use every tool at our disposal to end this national public health crisis.
That's all the time we have for question period. C'est tout le temps que nous avons.
That's all the time we have.
I know it's been brought to my attention that a couple of terms were used during question period today that were trying to accomplish indirectly what we can't do directly in the chamber. So I just want to remind everyone in the chamber that that is something that we have to respect, and it will increase the amount of respect that we have for each other in the chamber, allowing us